Non-metallic metal is one of those things which separates a casual painter from a serious one. But why do so many people struggle with it? Well, today I'm gonna show you exactly what you need to paint a convincing non-metallic metal, what is usually missing, and my secret system that'll make painting non-metallic metal easier than ever before. But first, should you even bother with non-metallic metal? I mean, true metallics also exist after all. Well, if you want to push your minis to another level, then the answer is yes. In traditional painting, they are not using any metallics, and yet the depiction of armor and weapons is supreme. The problem is that a poorly painted non-metallic metal will almost always look worse than true metallics. On the other hand, a properly executed non-metallic metal will make true metallics look like toy paint. And the reason why is because you have complete control over the reflection placement, rather than relying on mica powder in the paint. Well, there is another reason why metallics don't look as good, but I'll talk about that later. So let me share with you the ultimate, magnificent, revolutionary system that'll make painting non-metallic metal easier than ever before. I call it Flash. Flash stands for finding light, layering it, adding contrast, smoothing out, and highlighting edges. And I would argue that if your non-metallic metal doesn't look right, some of these steps are missing. However, if you follow this system, your non-metallic metal will look good every single time. Now, I've made a free checklist for this system, which makes it super convenient, so if you want to use it, there will be a link in the description. Just enter your email and I'll send it to you. Let's start with finding light. You see, we use non-metallic metal because we want to place the reflections manually. But then the question is, where do we put them? After all, if you don't place the reflections right, everything else is pointless. So first of all, if you haven't painted non-metallic metal yet, don't start on something that's straight up a flat surface. It might be an useful blending exercise, but it's better to start with something with volume. Here are some examples where you can practice. Space Marine helmets, other helmets, armor, or weapons that aren't just one flat plane. Once you have that, then it's easy. You should prime your miniature or that particular part in black and start from there. Now I want you to take that part, put it under a lamp and just notice how it reflects the light. Based on the best viewing angle of your miniature, you can simply copy the reflection placement just the way you see it right here. And usually, this is where I take a photo of that part in the best viewing angle for my model. Now again, if that particular part is flat, this method is less effective. That's because flat parts don't have any volume, so you'll have to randomize the reflections. What some people do is paint a checkboard pattern on the blade, or many evenly spaced out reflections. And this can work for illustrative purposes, but it doesn't look very believable. For a better result, you gotta make the placement more uneven and seemingly random. To a certain extent, I will do that on this spear, but I am getting ahead of myself. For objects that are more curved and have more volume, this method of using a black primer is absolutely excellent. You can still combine this way of finding reflections with other ones, like using other people's work as an inspiration, whether it's the same miniature or a different one. You can even look at 2D art and see how they paint metals. Either way, once you have a good idea where to paint light, we gotta layer it. Okay, listen up. After your base coat, all you gotta do is sketch the light where it's supposed to be, just like in your black primer reference. Now, this is important. You wanna use layers that cover really well. We're talking 1 to 3 passes max. If it takes more than that, what are you doing? At this point, you've probably noticed that my first layer is not too bright. This is because the less of a jump in brightness you make, the less you have to smooth it out later. Of course, we are still at the early stages, and there will be some adjustments. Notice that I paint some reflections where it's obvious from the black primer reference, but there are also some secondary or fake reflections. These represent light that's bounced from the environment. To some degree, these are a bit random, but certainly they follow two important rules. One, they are separated by a shade from the other reflections. And two, they are not as bright as the main reflections. If you follow that, you should be alright. Since metal is reflective, I also paint some of these fake reflections at the bottom. But again, at the end they'll be much darker than the ones on top. You can continue like this, and as long as you have the correct placement, it should work. Ideally, you wanna paint within the previous layer, but if you spread it out too much, you can blend it. And I'll show you exactly how later. But even if you decide not to blend it yet, as long as you have the right placement and contrast, you should kinda see where it's going. Oh yeah, and speaking of, add contrast. When we look back at some of the references, it's obvious that you can tell something is metal by seeing the contrast. This applies to complex depictions as well as illustrative ones. So if you have the right placement and you've already sketched a few layers, now it's all about pushing that contrast. At this point you are no longer thinking about where to paint light or your secondary reflections. Rather, you should make the reflections lighter. If it's needed, you can also darken some of the shades, but keep in mind that not all shadows will be equally dark. For that, I try to use thinner paint consistency. It's not too watery, but thin enough to have a good control. Even though you should make the reflections really light and the shadows quite dark, you still need midtones. This is especially true when painting gold non-metallic metal. Painting gold is challenging in particular because you specifically rely on including browns and ochres. So usually, it requires many adjustments whenever I paint it. And including those midtones on your metals is fine, as long as you have really light reflections and dark shadows. And I know that not all metals are super reflective, but it's a good thing to over-exaggerate to really sell the metallic impression. That's another reason why true metallics don't work too well on miniatures. Just think about it. Why do we shade our miniatures? You see, these models are supposed to represent something much bigger. But because they are tiny, light doesn't hit them the same way it would on a full-sized person. So to make it look believable, we gotta fake it. To do that, we manually shade our miniatures. It's to show how light should behave. That's why just slapping on a base coat and relying on real light doesn't work. It's just not enough at this scale. And the same goes for metallics. True metallics at this scale look like a toy paint because the light doesn't work the same way like it would on a full-sized piece of metal. But it also means that metallics work way better when it comes to painting statues. But that's a different topic. Either way, once you establish contrast to create that shiny metallic finish, it's time to smooth it out. Now, I know at this point we have a lot of information here. So just a reminder that if you join my newsletter using the link in the description, I'll send you the flash checklist so you can paint non-metallic metal easily. Smoothing out is exactly what it sounds like, but here's a caveat. The more layers you apply between your base coat and the final layer, the less you have to adjust. But if you want to make the result even smoother, which is not always necessary, here is what you can do. Either blend between each of the layers, or blend at the end with more intermediate colors. The first option is just about dragging a drop of pigment on the transition. Although this particular blade is not very credible, ignore that for now and just look at the technique. First, I start by sketching out the layers. Then, once I build up full coverage, I thin the same layer to around 60% water and 40% paint. This should be quite watery and you wanna wick off some of the paint, but not too much. Now you should drag the paint drop from the darker layer to the transition. If you do this enough times and you indeed leave the pigment right on the transition, congratulations, you learned how to blend. However, if you don't have enough room to drag the paint drop like this, you'll have to paint the transition with more midtones. Maybe this sounds complicated, but it's actually simple. Imagine that you have two layers like this right next to each other and you wanna blend them. If this is a small surface, you can simply take some of the intermediate colors and apply them on the transition. And these layers can be just as thick as the ones you've used for the initial sketch. And voila! Just like that, it's seamless. I use both of these, but again, if you don't have much room to work with, dragging the paint drop might be tricky. Let's talk about highlighting the edges. Although this is the 5th letter in the Flash system, keep in mind that only the first 2 letters have to be done in order. The other ones, meaning adding contrast, smoothing out, and highlighting the edges, can be done in any order. In fact, you'll most likely have to do some back and forth. Either way, we usually associate metal objects with sharpness. And by highlighting all the edges, that's exactly what we get. You want to highlight all the edges, but of course, the more exposed ones will be lighter. And despite the fact that I highlight every edge on my minis, on metals, you gotta push a step above. You can also see that some edges on your black primer reference will be super bright. Therefore, you can push it close to white. Once you're done with highlighting the edges, the paint job will feel way more unified. And if you execute all these steps in the Flash system, you'll end up with a credible, non-metallic metal. However, I can't emphasize this enough. If you don't know where to paint your light, everything else won't matter. So if you're still not sure how to paint light, check out this video next, because it'll help you with that. And see you there.